Better keep my mouth shut.
And we're live. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our last virtual event for the day, a survivor discussion with Rob Nossen. I have Rob Nossen here with me on YouTube, and I'm going to turn it over to him to introduce himself. Oh, you're muted, Rob.
Okay, I'm off. And my story is different than other the stories you heard this morning, or if you heard throughout the day. My parents are German, and my story actually starts in 1933 or even before. And I'll go more into that later on. But the video is based on a event that happened to me and my family, and primarily in 1943, where we were able to get El Salvador citizenship papers through correspondence with Geneva. The grandsons of the person who was a Colonel Castellano, Jose Castellano, from El Salvador, who provided these papers, they are building up his background and so forth, working with this. And so we were looking for a venue for one of our fundraisers for last December. And they were going to come down to Naples and do the program with us and live. Obviously, that didn't happen. What came out of that was the film that or the YouTube video that you're going to see now. And then after the video, I'll come back on and tell my story and be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
So Rob, for us, I'm going to start, and I just want to say how much of an honor it is to meet you, and that you are so vocal in your cause to making sure that my grandfather's rescue mission is remembered. For us, that's wonderful, because it's something that we've dedicated ourselves to doing as well, and it's such a rare privilege to meet somebody, a direct survivor. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for doing this, because for me, it's, as my father said, these papers saved our lives, literally. And he always attributed it, without those papers, we would not be alive, we would not have survived the war. Because everyone else in my family that got caught up, none of them survived.
So how many children do you have? If because weren't familiar with the personal details of your life.
Well, first of all, I've been married since 1963, so that's a few years. I'm probably longer than, so I've been married well over 50 years. I have 3 children, 1 boy, 2 girls. They are unusual for a survivor, or even for, my situation. 2 of them live in Naples, and 1 lives in a place called Cooper City, which is just near Fort Lauderdale. So in Florida. So we're a very close family. We get together often, and so forth. And then I have 4 grandchildren.
Have your grandchildren ever asked you about, are they the age that they begin to ask you about how you survived the war?
We talk about it, but not even my children know about it, but doesn't come up in the conversations. And the reality is, this goes back to, and they have copies of my father's story and everything like that. They understand what's going on, but there is a gap in that. We bring it up, but it's not, it's not a major issue for them. And part of it is that even for us, it wasn't, when we came to the United States, we didn't really talk about it, until many years afterwards. We wanted to start a new life. That's my parents' approach. And that became our primary focus.
Our grandfather is credited, along with his friend, George Montello, as saving thousands of lives during the Holocaust. The rescue mission took place from about 1942 till the end of the war. We would find it very interesting to know just how your family received the paper and the mechanics behind that.
Well, the background is my father was on what we call the Palestine list. These were Jews that were recognized that if the British would take us, the Germans would let us go to Palestine. So a friend of his had been able to get the papers, but he was in Amsterdam, and my father found out about it. And this is before, in the spring, or even maybe at the end of 42, beginning of 1943, that he found out what was needed, got those papers, and sent them to I believe the consulate at that point. The papers were actually dated. The certificate of citizenship was dated in March of 1943. We didn't get them right away because they were sent to the Jewish community in Amsterdam, and by that time that had been disbanded. So my father didn't get the papers until we came back. We first went in June 1943. We went to a place called Westerbork, and we were there for 3 months. And then when we came back in September 1943, we were able to get the papers. So there was a 6-month lag between the time the papers were issued until we got them. So I don't know what the mechanics specifically were, but apparently there was communication. I know between Switzerland and Holland, even during the war.
Judy Cohen at the Museum for Human Rights estimated that about 10,000 people, at least, according to her estimate, were saved by the Castellanos-Montello documents. But yet very little is known about my grandfather. And this is common to a lot of the righteous among the nations, not to complain, but this is very common to a lot of the righteous. You mentioned that you have tried to impress this fact to audiences, that the scope of the rescue that you are part of. Can you tell us a little bit about that, about how you have, when you speak, you try to impress on people the size of the Castellanos rescue?
Well, I didn't know the exact number. I knew there were thousands. When I talk to school groups, and then primarily we're talking to what we call our middle school, and often I would talk to the whole school at different, the fact that these papers saved our lives. And that this was an unusual circumstance without that. And the scope of it, I didn't know myself what the scope was, okay? And so I think that's part of it. Also, your father's name is not on the paper. If you look at mine, his name is not on the document per se. That was one of my questions. I mean, it was like the first secretary too, or with Montello. It was his name on the documents. And I don't know, I was going to ask how many people were in that situation where your grandfather's name was not on the document, it was rather his friend.
As far as we know from the research that we've done, in 1942, when they actually started the mass production of these documents, I think they produced 13,000, around thereabouts, 13,000 documents. And so what they did is at the Salvadoran consulate in Geneva, they set up in the basement of the building, they set up like a little factory of documents. So basically, there would be 5 or 6 people typing out documents feverishly. So my grandfather had made George Mantello and had authorized him to sign the papers. So they were authorized by the Salvadoran government through my grandfather, even though the Salvadoran government at first didn't know anything about it. The mission was it had to be so fast. These documents had to be printed out so fast that Mantello's signature went on it, and that was the only signature that went on it. But they were authorized by my grandfather and thereby the Salvadoran government. They would keep the original, and they had a photostat machine, and then they would send out the photostat. So the document that you have in your possession is probably the photostat of the original document. In 2005, 1,300 of these documents were found in a suitcase in Switzerland in a dusty basement somewhere. So those are the documents that now reside at the U.S. Holocaust Museum.
So the vast majority were signed by Mr. Mantello also because he was the distributor in chief of the document. The idea came from my grandfather and Mr. Mantello, who were trying to save Mr. Mantello's brother. So then when they saw that it worked for him, they said, oh, well, this might be a great thing to reproduce. And there are those specimens signed by my grandfather because this was one of the things Yad Vashem needed to find, because until we found documents signed by my grandfather, it could have been argued that maybe Mr. Mantello was doing this on his own, but then they found various documents also signed by my grandfather. But most of them are signed and distributed by Mr. Mantello, who through his networks distributed the document, in the Jewish community. Some of the survivors who received the papers don't know who requested them. Do you know specifically the person who requested your paper? And how do you know that your father or your family didn't purchase the document?
With what? No, we did not purchase it. Okay. We had to supply the photos, first of all. This document originated out of Switzerland. My father found out from a friend of his who was able to obtain the documents, and he gave my father the information to count. So we know for a fact that he did not pay for them. He submitted the papers through the agent. I believe he went through the agency in Switzerland and had it sent the documents there, because that was his contact. And we were getting correspondence from them.
There have been comparisons made of our grandfather, comparing him to the likes of Raoul Wallenberg. That's quite a comparison. I mean, Raoul Wallenberg saved thousands and thousands of lives. How would you compare or distinguish the rescue mission of our grandfather to other rescue missions that you're aware of?
The comparable one is Mendez, the Portuguese consul in France, who I think had a similar number. And actually, there's a street named after him in Bayonne, France. And he did the same thing. He gave out Portuguese papers, similar type of process.
Can you tell us of an example at which the document was actually used? Maybe somebody looked at it, or an anecdote that you remember from your father saying, oh, we used a document at this point and it was a critical moment, etc., something like that?
The timeline was that my father got the documents in September 1943 when we were allowed to go back to Amsterdam at the request of his company, because he was doing defense-related work for the Germans. His company was, and he was a senior engineer for a chemical engineer who had helped in developing this process for recycling batteries that they could use, the Germans could use. And in fact, they set up a plant in Westerbork, the transit camp, and he would travel back and forth between Amsterdam and Westerbork even after we were released and sent back. When we got back to Amsterdam, we got these papers. We were considered foreigners rather than Jews. Had more freedom to travel within Amsterdam. We were not subject to the same restrictions. Also, when we were in the final roundup in September 1944, we ended up again going to Westerbork, which is the transit camp. And from there, we went to Theresienstadt, which is where the foreigners were, where they interned the foreigners, rather than going to Bergen-Belsen and so forth. In October of 1944, were the last roundups from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. Auschwitz was the only death camp still in operation at that point. And everyone was concerned to be on that last. My father knew what was happening, and he thought we were going to be rounded up as well. And what happened actually was that none of the foreigners would be deported to Auschwitz at that time. Then a third step, when we were liberated by the Russians, we eventually, at the end of May, we were turned over to the Americans and ended up in DP camp temporarily. And even there, when my father showed him our papers with the citizenship, the American person in charge said, well, you're an American, and allowed us to go into town, gave us freedom. Even in the DP camp, we were not stuck in the DP camp. So there were 3 instances where it helped us.
One of the things we always try to, we always ask of any direct survivor is, if my grandfather, Colonel Castellanos, was speaking to you right now, what would you say to him?
The bottom line is, if it weren't for him, we would not be alive. That's the bottom line. And thank him for that. You have to understand, at the time in 1940, when Holland was invaded, there was a total of 15 family members there. My brother, myself, and my parents were the only survivors. We would not have survived without those papers, without these citizenship papers from El Salvador.
And Robert, it's been such an incredible pleasure for us to meet someone who survived the Holocaust, especially through the Castellanos rescue mission. These opportunities are very far and few between. So we really thank you for your time.
The only thing that I regret is that you didn't have a chance to talk to my brother, because he was a teenager. And he would have enjoyed talking to you also.
Well, we want to also thank the Holocaust Museum and the Cohen Center for this great opportunity. It's been for us a great meeting of really, for us, many of the answers you've given us are missing links, we might say, to our research. For instance, the piece about you being classified as an American, for us, is incredibly meaningful to hear from a survivor. So we really owe the Holocaust Museum and the Cohen Education Center a lot, and we really appreciate everyone there and Susan for their efforts in making this possible, as we have traveled the world trying to tell the story of not only my grandfather, but the other righteous among the nations. So thank you to you and to Susan and to the entire Nossen family, and David as well.
Studies have proven that by helping students to develop a greater understanding of the Holocaust and its impact, they can also better recognize the dangers of anti-Semitism and discrimination, and the importance of standing up for others and for stopping something similar from happening again. Research also suggests that students with Holocaust education have greater empathy and ability to work cooperatively with people of diverse backgrounds. One of the most powerful teaching methods is storytelling. That's why we share stories like the one you heard today about the impact of the courage of an upstander like Colonel Castellanos. Thank you for joining us in bringing these stories to students all across Southwest Florida.
What a powerful story, Rob. And that was excellent. An excellent interview that you had. We haven't had any, actually, I do need to post in some information into the YouTube chat about how to access the Holocaust Museum's website and their YouTube channel. There is a question, what your grandfather did for so many family was amazing, as a comment to the Castellanos. Are there any questions for Rob directly that I can certainly pass along from the chat to him? And I know he also has some other images and documents to share if any of you are interested. We have a question. How old was Rob and his brother?
Well, do you have any idea? Yeah, at that time in 1943, my brother was 13 and I was 5. So I was born in 1938. But I don't know if people are watching or not, so I can't tell if anybody's interested in hearing the rest of my story. But I'm willing to discuss that at length or within the confines of roughly the hour we have.
Although we may only have 8 viewers at this very moment, I'm sure that they would be very interested in your story. Oh, let's see here. Did you ever find out what happened to the rest of your family?
My grandmother died before she was taken. We lived in the same house. My parents, by the way, just the background, my parents left Germany in 1933, lived and through work went to Denmark, then Belgium, and then settled in Netherlands or Holland in 1936. That's where I was born in 1938. After Kristallnacht, a lot of my families in 1938-39 tried to get out different places. Like one of my uncles ended up in the Shanghai ghetto, another ended up in Palestine. Third family members ended up in the Dominican Republic. But a good number, and some had made it to the United States. You have to understand that the Germans went after the Jews in Germany starting in 1933, and Hitler was trying to drive them out of Europe. So quite a few made it to the United States. So I do have relatives that came in the 30s, but it was very difficult for most of the Jews to get there. We were in a different situation because my father worked in Holland, had a job, and was there volunteering. So we were considered permanent residents. We were not refugees. So after Kristallnacht, we ended up having 15 family members. As I said in the story, my My brother, the four of us were the only survivors. My grandmother died in 42. Uh, my grandfather was taken in January of 1943. We never heard of him again. Every indication was that he was sent directly to Auschwitz. Other family members went to different camps. And as I said, we were fortunate to end up eventually in Theresienstadt, which was a model ghetto, quote unquote model ghetto, and that's helped our survival, obviously. But our restrictions started much earlier. Holland was invaded in May of 1940, and they kind of left us alone. They didn't set up the ghettos in Western Europe the way they did in Poland and so forth, because there weren't as many Jews. So for the first year, they left us alone. And then they started doing the same restrictions that they had implemented in Germany over a period of time. They started doing the same thing there. No longer allowed in public parks, sports places, swimming pools, restaurants, drive cars, and travel outside of town limits. In 1942, they came in with the Jewish Star, separated us from the Christians in schools, and also eventually Jews were forced to move into Amsterdam, Dutch Jews, to facilitate further roundup. The Jewish community opened up Jewish schools. Our brother went to the same school actually as Anne Frank, but he was a year behind her. And then they started their first deportations in 1942 as well. And as I said, they didn't use the ghettos, so they had set up this transit camp called Westerbork, which had been a refugee camp for Jews in the late 1930s, because there were so many of them trying to get into Holland, they had no place for them. So they set up this camp, which eventually became it. And so if you want to, let me share this. I had it. Okay, sorry. I had it before. So we ended up in June of 1943. We ended up going to Westerbork again. We went there. And Westerbork was, as I said, was a transit camp. And here's some pictures of it. You see everyone with Jewish stars.
I think it may be on a different monitor, Rob. Right now, we just see your files on your USB drive.
Oh, so how do you win? What am I doing wrong?
You may just need to drag your PowerPoint onto the monitor with your USB drive.
Okay. Well, let me expand this. Okay. Let me minimize this. Okay.
Okay. I saw it momentarily.
Okay.
But right, yeah, so I think if you minimize the file folder there.
Right.
Yeah, because I saw it for just a split second.
It's underneath, yeah.
Unless maybe you're sharing not the screen, but rather the file viewer. Maybe if you stop sharing and try selecting the presentation instead as one of the options.
I'm reopening the meeting. This is minimized, so. I've got you. Where am I?
Um, you might not see yourself because you're presenting your screen. If you want, I can force a stop of your screen share and then you can try sharing again.
Okay, let me try new resume share or share. Well, let me talk about it, maybe. Can you see that?
I still see your file window.
You see the file?
Just the window where where you're selecting the presentation. But I don't see the presentation.
I saw it before, so I don't know why you're not seeing it now. What can I tell you? You have access. You don't have access to it, huh?
No, I don't. Here, let me stop your sharing real quick. And if you want, try doing the share menu again.
Let me open the file first and then try to share it.
That's the best thing because then you'll see it as a window that you can select in the screen sharing options.
Okay, I've got it open. There it is. See it?
It's coming through. There we go. Absolutely perfect.
Okay, so what you have here are just some pictures from the Teresa site. You could edit it out later. From Westerbork. And this was a camp, and this was the original camp that was set up back in the 1930s. It was a work camp, you could see. It's pretty standard. And these are the boxcars coming in with people coming to the camp. Okay. Everyone wears civilian clothes. They all have Jewish stars. This is a morning roundup and so forth. They usually had a couple of thousand people there at a time, and generally there were some permanent people who ran the camp, including primarily Jews, and then there were people that were shipped out on a regular basis. These are and the best way to describe it, I describe it, and this is the actual layout of the camp with fenced. I describe it more similar to the idea of what the camps were from the internment of the Japanese type of setup. Okay. And also, by the way, later, these are more examples of boxcars and so forth. This is my citizenship paper. I want to point out a couple of things since it came out of Geneva. It's in French. El Salvador, the language is Spanish, which none of us knew. My parents knew a little bit of French, but and neither did the Germans. So they looked at these papers; they couldn't even read them per se. But it was self-explanatory. So the interesting thing. So let me close this out then. All right. So this was where we were for 3 months until September. We came back to Amsterdam, but by the time we came back, we had lost everything that we had before. Now, we had lived in the same house from 1936 to 1943 until we were sent to camps. We lost all of that. My father's company found us an apartment, it was more like a tenement apartment, very little. The schools were closed by that time, so my brother could no longer go to school. I couldn't go to school, but my father continued to go to work. So throughout the war, from 1940 until 1945, except at the time that we were in the camps, my father went to work every day by bicycle. The next place, so we were fine, and we ended up. In 1944 September, this was near the end of the war. the southern part of Holland had been, the southern part of Holland had been liberated by the Allies, but then the Germans ended up going into Germany directly and started moving east into Germany, and decided to bypass the northern part of Holland, including Amsterdam, where we were. Amsterdam itself was not liberated until the end of April of 1945. So, and conditions that year were exceptionally bad for the people. Starvation, cold, and so forth. And at the end of August, beginning of September, they rounded up the last Jews that were not in mixed marriages. If you were in a mixed marriage, they left you alone. You could stay. But they rounded up and sent us again back to Westerbork. And there were 3 places that people went from there. Bergen-Belsen, Auschwitz, or Theresienstadt, which was a model ghetto. There was a movie made about it. The Swedish Red Cross had come in earlier that year, and they put on a big show for it. So it was kind of different than what they had anticipated. By the time we got there, they already started shipping people out. So this was in September, as I said. They're closing down a lot of things and so forth. Just a little background on Theresienstadt. It was 150,000 people that went through there. And should come up right away. And of those, less than 20,000 survived. Over 30,000 died in Theresienstadt itself. Now, this is a photograph of the city as it looks today. Theresienstadt was a fortress, a late 18th century fortress for the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. It's in Czechoslovakia, but that was part of Austria.
Just to interrupt momentarily, we're not seeing the PowerPoint presentation of Theresienstadt. And also you did have a question of how did your family get papers when others could not?
Well, we applied for them. This was not the norm. The people that got the papers, most of them, the problem with the papers was like everything else. We had contacts. We knew people that were there. We had to go through Geneva to get them. And as I said, there was postal service between the two. But it was actions on the part of my father through contacts he had both in Holland and in Switzerland, that enabled us to get these papers. And they were handed out to people that, based on availability, if they were around, if they could use them. So, because you had it wasn't just hand a piece of paper. You had to have photos, and you had to, all of the information that was required for it. So it was not a simple process of just handing out the paper. Now, back to Theresienstadt. I'll go very quickly. This was the fortress, what it looked like. Initially, we were in barracks. And then eventually we got one room in the officers' quarters where there were 5 rooms and 5 families sharing one bathroom and a kitchen. We had the camp was run by the Jews. It was a ghetto officially. It had factories there, but it was under the control of the Nazis, obviously. As I said, only less than 20,000 of the people that went through there. So it was an area, before the war, it was a garrison town for Czechoslovakia, and about 7,500 people were living there at the time. but conditions were obviously very bad. And fortunately, my mother had sewn some money into her. It had a yarn thing, spindle. So, and they were going to take everything away because normally they would take all your personal possessions, and she was able to hang on to that. Also, since they were deporting so many people at that time, that opened up jobs for. My mother took a job in had to work in the hospital, and we got rations. We even had fake money, but we got rations, and the rations we could use, to trade for food. But the they got spread. But so what they did, the hospital staff did, is if somebody died, they wouldn't tell the Germans for several days, and thereby get their rations as well. My father worked in a laboratory testing flour, and often they would get extra flour in there that wasn't needed, and he would smuggle that out of the laboratory. My brother ended up getting tuberculosis there, and he ended up spending most of the time in the hospital. I was in a children's home for a while, so I got some extra food, rations and so forth were there. As I said earlier, most of the remaining Jews that stayed there were special. They were Danes, foreign nationals, and some Jews that were converted. One of the things that also happened at that time, and this gives you an idea, the conditions there, they're pretty bad. Here, people waiting on a food line, actually, because most people were living in barracks rather than their own. This is some of the examples. We also had a crematorium, and people were surprised, to hear that. But every camp had a crematorium, pretty much, because the winter conditions were very bad. They couldn't, efficiently take care of the remains of people dying there. As I said, about 30,000 or 20% of the people there died from disease and malnutrition. And the rest was shipped out to Auschwitz from there. We were not that far, physically, we were not that far from Auschwitz, so it was not a big train ride. Our initial train ride from Holland, to Czechoslovakia to Theresienstadt was about 36 hours in a boxcar with some water, a slop bucket, and basically no food. So, but it was only, this is more about that. If you go there today, it's still there. It's part of it is a museum, the Ghetto Museum, and on the other side there's a place for the small fortress, the cemetery, and this is what they call the small fortress. There's some pictures of that. This typical Arbeit macht frei sign. These are wall that was an execution wall that was used. This was not in the ghetto. This was in the small fortress, which was a concentration camp that had been set up. The other thing, this is children's art from because there were, until 1943 or 44, early 44, there were children by themselves that were housed, and they kept them busy, and they were able to do artwork. They had a choir there, they had music and so forth until the end. And that was the Jews. It was similar to other ghettos where they set up their own thing. You can stop now. Okay. So that was the situation. In April of 1945, about Jews came. There was a thing called a death march, and throughout Europe, where the Germans would move Jewish prisoners from camp to camp to keep them away from the Russians. because they didn't want the Russians to know how many people had died in Auschwitz. When Auschwitz was liberated, there were only about 7,500 prisoners there. About 15,000 Jews ended up coming to Theresienstadt in April of 1945. And while we were in a ghetto, you wore civilian clothes. Okay, you didn't have the striped pajamas. Well, these people came from the camps, and they wore striped pajamas. They were emaciated, and many of them were very sick and mentally disabled and diseased as well. So fortunately for us, they were isolated from us. Then in May, May 1945, the Russians came in, or Soviets, if you want to call it that, and supposedly liberated the camp. And that was May 8th, 1945. But the Germans ran away before that, and then because they knew the Russians were coming and they didn't want to be caught by them. With good reason, because most German prisoners who were from Russia, many of them never came back. And once they got into the Russian system, and the ones that did, it was like 10 years later that they first got back, and usually just to the countries that had been taken over by the Russians during the war. So the Red Cross, the Czech Red Cross came in, ran the camp until the Russians came in. We were then turned over to the Americans after several weeks at the end of May. And again, this is what we're talking about, where they gave us the freedom that I mentioned in the video. And by June of 1945, we were back in Amsterdam. My father went back to work. We ended up getting a furnished apartment previously occupied by Dutch Nazi. And my brother and I went back to school. I started school and he went back to school. All of the 100,000 Jews in Holland that went to the camps, which was most those that were not in hiding or were exempt, only 5,000 came back. Of the 5,000 that was sent, roughly, of Jews that sent to Theresienstadt, only a quarter of those came back. So, obviously we were very lucky, and much of that is attributable to the papers, the video, as explained in the video. In 1948, we came to the United States, settled in a place called Paterson, New Jersey. And the reason we came at that point, my father had gone back to work, but my brother graduated secondary school, and we had no family left there. And conditions were still, rationing was still going on, and we had family in the U.S. So that was the reason. So we came to the U.S. in 1948, not as refugees, because we came in under the German quota. The interesting thing was, one of the things, I was never Dutch because they don't have birthright. So I was considered stateless, except on my citizenship papers for the U.S. It shows my prior citizenship as El Salvador. And after that, it's the typical American life. And so it kind of finished on that. So if there are questions, I'd be happy to answer any other questions that,
We haven't received any additional questions, but a lot of people, one, were very happy to hear your story, because when we asked if they wanted to hear your story, you had a resounding yes from the audience. Okay. Many have commented that you have a very amazing story and that they thank you for sharing it.
I kind of, my story, I try to combine my story with the video, but it's the two things about, there were a lot of people that helped the Jews. Colonel Castellano was viewed as one of the righteous, as was Schindler, by the way, a similar situation. There are others, quite a few. There are about 24,000 that have been honored that way. And so, because a lot of people helped. Without them, quite a few more would have died. But the Holocaust wasn't just about the Jews, and I think that's another thing I want to just mention as closing. There were 12 million people that died in the Holocaust, roughly, probably even more, and half of those were Jews. But there were also, the other big group, there were like 3 million prisoners of war that ended up dying, and about 2 million Polish civilians. Why? Because they were used in the slave labor camps primarily, and among other things. So the whole idea, so there are a lot of people that died in the Holocaust, not just as Jews. And I think if just focusing on the Jews does not give them the same respect that they deserve, or, remembrance that they deserve. So I just want to end with that.
Thank you for that. And you did receive two more questions. What do you personally remember during that time? What were you thinking? How did you feel is one question.
I felt, well, I was 6 years old. When we came out of Kansas in 1944, I was 6 years old. Okay. 45, I was 7 years old. I remember a lot of stuff, but I don't remember it necessarily the same way my brother was born in 1930, the way he remembered, or my parents. So much of what I'm telling is their story, or the story of my family rather than mine. I didn't feel, obviously, if you're a small child, I had my parents, I had my brother. Conditions weren't great, obviously. So it didn't affect me the same way it affected them. And that they were much more affected, particularly my brother was much more affected by it, even though he had lived a full life and everything like that. So that's the only thing. It's hard to, you're not going to find too many survivors that have that a lot of specific memories, because we were all children, small children at that point. So.
The other question was, at such a young age, going to school to start, did you encounter a lot of schoolmates who asked questions, or did people not ask? Maybe it was different for your brother as a teen?
People didn't really ask that much. When we came to Patterson, when we came to New Jersey, my brother spoke English. Okay, my parents spoke English. We had relatives. My aunt lived there, and they had gotten out. Originally, they ended up in Dominican Republic and then made it to the United States. But we were sponsored. But we came in July, and I ended up going into school. I was 10 at the time. And I started school in September of the same year. I wasn't given a chance to, English as a second language was not an option, teaching of that or anything like that. So I was starting off reading and learning English using comic books. And the first time I spoke German as well as Dutch. So in the summer, for the first month or so, I ended up in a Jewish day camp. And they spoke to me in Yiddish, and which is much of it is German, and I responded in German. So, no, people accepted you. We were in an area where we were accepted, and people didn't talk that much about it, really. They didn't ask a lot of questions, as far as I recall. That became up much more later on, when it became, most people just wanted to go on with their lives and not talk about it.
And then you have another one. When you came to America, did you find people with similar stories, maybe even through the work that you do at the Holocaust Museum?
Well, if you listen to some of the stories, most of the people that talk today I've met through the Holocaust Museum. There were many more. The Holocaust Museum in Naples started 20 years ago, actually. But it came out of a school project in the Collier public schools, or in one of our middle schools. And they did an exhibit, but also there were many survivors in the United States, and particularly in Florida, that settled in Naples, and that became, and they really ended up being the backbone of the survivors ended up the backbone of the museum. We've gotten to we are on our third museum now. It's expanded regularly. And I encourage students to come down here, come to the museum and visit us. We're open, by the way, on a limited schedule. You have to register beforehand. You can just go to our website, the Holocaust, hmcec.org, and register, and invite you to come and join us. But but it used to be, the other thing is people didn't talk about it as much because most of us felt they weren't everybody wanted to go on with their life. And so we didn't think people were that interested in it. And as time went on, particularly with the Holocaust Museum in New York and Washington, that changed the dynamic of talking. So.
And we have one more final question before we wrap up today. Did you find the religious viewpoints or beliefs of your family change after experiencing this?
Not really. My parents went to synagogue before. We were liberal Jews, okay, what they call Reform Jews. We continued to be Reform Jews. We were temple members. I was bar mitzvahed. Actually, I was bar mitzvahed in an Orthodox synagogue because we came late and I couldn't go through the whole curriculum. And they agreed to do it. But, and so we have remained temple members throughout, and my brother was the same. My parents were, until they passed away, they were temple members as well. So it didn't really change our perception of religion. We didn't blame, why did this happen? The other thing is the Jews in Germany were very well off. And my parents had no desire to come to the United States before Hitler came to power. Okay, they were very comfortable. Our families had lived in Germany for generations. My father had a doctorate in engineering. My mother's family was well off, and so our life was, they had a very comfortable life there. So, and we viewed it as we look forward. Most of your survivors survive by moving on. And that's the difference, that's what I call a survivor. Because you don't have any opportunities to look. If you dwell on the past and you get caught up in it, then it'll destroy you.
We do have another question that came in. What about your family, your wife and kids? Was your wife Jewish? Did your kids go to Jewish schools?
No, my wife is Jewish. I'd been married, it'll be 58 years this year. Her family she was born in the States. Her family came in the early 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s from what is today Belarus. So you're talking East Germans. So it's a mixed marriage because German Jew with the East European Jew, they're different culture, different bread and so forth. So they were more religious as well. But, our kids were all bar and bat mitzvah. I'm unique because I went into the military. I took ROTC and I retired from the military. For a while I was active duty and then I retired from the reserves. And we came down to Florida in 1994. And I'm one of the few retirees, and have been full time, who 2 of my children live in Naples and the third one lives on the East Coast near Fort Lauderdale. So, and they were raised Jewish. So, except all of them are, my brother and one of them is divorced, but the other 2 are married to non-Jews. But and I have a granddaughter who was raised Jewish also, and she's actually graduating from a master's program to FSU the next month. So, it's we're fortunate because we have our grandchildren here. We have our children and grandchildren here.
It's wonderful that all of you are located in Florida too, so it's not so much of a distance to like travel across the country.
We've been getting together periodically. We're getting to get a Friday for Passover, a Saturday for Passover. I mean, my daughter on the East Coast lives in 90 minutes away, an hour and a half, and in fact, she's coming over earlier. So, and and they're fortunately for us also, all of our kids are vaccinated now as well. But we were still getting together even before that for birth, for events. So we've been very fortunate in all respects.
And we have another question. How did you feel when you met the Castellanos brothers? How was that experience for you? How,
Well, we never met. We were supposed to. Meet. Personally. And they were going to be part of the program. So we were discussing this program we had. The video was from December for a program in December, but it was actually recorded in the late spring of last year. So we were communicating. They were supposed to come down for that, and we were obviously coming up with the program. The problem was the COVID prevented that, so we were doing everything through Zoom. So I have never met them formally. I've seen them through the video and so forth, but I've never personally met them. So this was all done, electronically.
Just as it is today. Just as it is today.
Yeah, well, it's going away. Two of my children are in virtual school on the East Coast, and they're not even in partial, they're full virtual. But hopefully we'll be out of that. And then more and more people that I'm in my age group are being vaccinated now. So, and that gives us freedom. But we're fortunate that, we weren't sick. One of my son-in-laws got the virus from his parents, because they decided to go to a restaurant and they got the virus. Fortunately, they're fine, but and he's fine, and we were concerned about it, but so it's been good.
Well, I want to thank you again so much for speaking with us tonight, Rob. I know that you've spoken for many of our events in the past, and of course, our deep appreciation goes out to you working with us practically every single year. This is the end of our YouTube live series of videos for today, but we do have a program for tomorrow. Let me just pull that up really quick. I have sent out the link to the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center through the chat. And for Wednesday, we have 2 YouTube live events, one at 9:30 in the morning with Dr. Lauren Maddock, who will be talking about Ravensbrück. The other YouTube live event will be at 6 p.m. We have a guest lecture of Dr. Paul Bartrop, who will be giving a lecture from Australia. And we also have a 2:00 p.m. Zoom book discussion. And the details, let me place our electronic schedule into the chat. And of course, you're getting many comments of thank you in the YouTube chat, Rob.
Steve, I enjoy doing this, obviously, and I think, to me, it's important. One of the things about the Holocaust that people have to remember, it happened ended 75 years ago, but genocide is still going on. And that's where we're going. And in fact, we had a meeting of our board last night, and we had with a consultant, and we were talking about taking the museum forward, going more into human rights as well, and our focus. But again, I invite everybody to come to the museum. Uh, if you try to do it, if I'm there, I docent there. We have docent programs and so forth, and we still do that in the mornings. And the museum is open from 1 to 4. Right now, 4 days a week, but probably in April we may be going back to 6 days a week. And we're getting more and more people coming to the museum. And if you got a couple of hours to kill, you need something to do, you're welcome to join us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to end the YouTube live stream now. Thank you everyone for sticking with us and watching and joining with us this evening. Oh, and there is, other than the Naples Museum, are there other places, museums in the United States? There certainly are. If you do a search of Holocaust museums, there's one in Washington, D.C., and they're all over the place. But I know that the Washington, D.C. is wonderful.
There's a large museum in St. Petersburg.
Oh, okay.
With a boxcar. We have a boxcar also, but we can't keep it here, so we have it. It's right at the moment. It's at one of our libraries, and because we don't have storage for it, we haven't figured out. We're working again on trying to do something, but we've had a boxcar that was we have the only traveling boxcar because we would take it to schools. We took it to Florida Southwestern. We used to have it every year up there, and if we didn't have a COVID, it probably would have been up there this year again. So and so we very much. The museum is responsible, covers a 5-county area, roughly 5 or 6 counties, so up to Sarasota, really. The St. Petersburg is a much bigger museum, and it's only, maybe 2.5 hours, not even 2.5 hours. Well, particularly from Fort Myers, it's even less. It's about a 2-hour ride, and you could check that out on it. But that's the closest one, I believe. I don't think Sarasota has any. I'm not sure about that. They may have programs, but I'm not sure. So.
Well, thank you so much. I forgot about the St. Petersburg Museum. So thank you, everyone. And we'll hopefully see you all tomorrow in our virtual land of YouTube Live.
I may join you. Well, the 7 o'clock